Vosai, we're up to the bottom of Daf Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, 2 lines up from the bottom. And let's keep in mind, in order to have a takeoff, a soft takeoff for this sugya of Rabba Bar Bar Chana, that yesterday he instructed his son with regard to that special issue about Chelev the Isera, that his son in Bavel should not be makil about eating this Chelev the Isera. Why? Because his son had not received a Horah. He received Edus, as we discussed yesterday, but not Horah. The Horah came from the previous generation, which was Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbah had received the Horah, so he could therefore
Here didn't go
he could
because he
therefore
wanted to watch the big football games were on the playoffs or whatever. So he stayed home and watched the football.
could therefore
dig into it.
I don't know why this isn't working for me. So therefore, Rabba Bar Bar Chana, relying on the Horah that he received from Rabbi Yochanan, could allow himself to eat this Chelev the Isur anywhere, whether it's Befanov or Shalo Befanov. However, his son did not receive such a Horah, and therefore, because again, as we said yesterday, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana was incapable of making that Horah, even though he was a Mora Horah, he was Samoch and Igil Horah, but in that issue, he didn't have any logical, compelling, analytic reasons to come to the conclusion that this Chelev was Mutter. They relied totally on the Horah, the decision Achra of Rabbi Yochanan, but the son of Rabbi Bar Chana did not have that license. And therefore, since he was in a suffix situation, he had, on the one hand, knowledge of the Horah of Rabbi Yochanan, but on the Tzad Shekeneged, he had the Horahs of the Tachmei Bavel. Therefore, we apply the principle of suffix Dorais Luchum. Upliga didei didei. Now we're going to see that in a different context, Rabbah himself contradicted his original position the way he instructed his son. And now we're going to learn a discussion about what's called Sviche Kruv. Now, the halacha is that with regard to, yeah.
Can you explain the difference between Horah and Psak?
Horah means that you made a decision, you had a proof, you had a logically compelling reason, and Psak just means you're passing on what you heard from your Rebbein, but it's not an original Psak.
Well, there had to be originally a Psak. Original Horah produces a Psak.
Right, but the original Horah came from a different generation. So in the previous generation, let's say Rabbi Yochanan's generation, Rabbi Yochanan had the capacity to find some sort of logically compelling reason to be machriya. Machriya means to decide the halacha. In the next generation, they didn't have that ability. They were just, paskening based on what they heard from their Rebbe.
Agreed. So doesn't halacha always follow that? If Rav Moshe is machriya Horah, right? That means we're not allowed to follow that?
You're allowed to follow it unless, and here's the exception to the rule, there are other Mori Hara that also made a Hachra, and they came to the opposite conclusion.
No.
And then you're
so
stuck
that happens. That happens all the time. So Rav Moshe had a psak about artificial insemination, a Hachra, and the Rabbonim and the Satmar Rav did. He came to the opposite conclusion. So
again,
every door after that can't decide.
Then you come into a different question of at what point can I decide which Mora Hora I accept? In this case, keep in mind that the son of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana is compelled by the virtue of the fact that he's in Bavel to consider the Hora of Bavel. Now, if let's say you were living in Williamsburg, you might actually, I'm not posketing, but you might actually have to accept the Hora of the Satmar Rav. But if you're in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, then you can accept the Hora of Moshe. So that's a different issue. But in this case, the son of Rabbi Bar Chana had the same commitment to the Chachmei Bavel as he did to the Psak of
The-
Rabbi Yochanan, who came from Eretz Yisrael. In
the
fact,
fi-
you might have said that we don't even need to introduce Safek Doraisa L'Chumra. Maybe simply because the son of Rabbi Bar Chana finds himself in Bavel, that itself should be Machayev him. And that could be a good question. But perhaps against that, he has the Hora Rabbi Yochanan because he himself, the son of Rabbi Bar Chana, has roots in Eretz Yisrael. So then it comes under our Mishnah of Makom Shenog. So let's just see if we can begin to understand the stira between the original statement of Rabbi Bar Chana to his son in the context of Chelev the Isera, and now we're going to talk about the status of Sfichei Kru. Now let's understand a little bit about Sfichim. Sfichim are vegetables or grains or fruits that grow naturally on their own without any work, without any malacha or avodah on the part of the farmer. Those are called sfichim. Now, what happens is that with regard to shvius, at a certain point, we have what's called a mitzvah biur. And again, right now, we're going to have to just touch the surface of biur, because biur is a gigantic sugya in Masechet Shvius. But what we do have to know is that every single species of Zraim has a cutoff point, a certain date, which is called the Zman HaBiur. Now, what's the difference between the status of the fruits, grains, etc., before that cutoff point and after the cutoff point? What does this Chiyuv Biur mean? It means that if you have any fruits or vegetables, etc., that belong to that species, up until the cutoff point, you're allowed to take these fruits and these grains, etc., and eat them. And you don't have to take them out of your house. Comes the Shas Biur, which means the cutoff point, then you have to bring them out and be mafkir them. You have to let them be ownerless and invite all the people and the aniyim and so forth to come and take these fruits. Now, that cutoff point shifts based on two variables. Variable number one is what the species is, and variable number two is the location. Both of these come to the same exact principle. And that abstract principle is called kol l'chayim min asad. So it means that when there's no longer foodstuff of that particular species out there in the fields for the chaya to eat, that's called the cutoff point. And that's the Shas Bir. That's when you have to take your fruits out of your house and be mafkid. Now, every single fruit, vegetable, etc., has a cutoff point. Why? Because at some point it's no longer growing out in the fields. So that's called kol l'chayim min asad, and therefore we set up at that moment, in that location, Shas HaBir. There's one exception. Every rule has to have an exception, and that's the kruv. The kruv, which has roots underground, the cabbage, and leaves above the ground, is able to maintain itself throughout the entire winter season. There is no cutoff point, which is called Shas HaBir. Now, again, if he had violated the Isur Shvius and he had planted this kruv, then for sure it would be awesome. That goes without saying. But in the case of Svichim, he didn't do any violation. He did not work the ground. He did not plant these cabbages. And therefore, the only reason that this cabbage would become usher at some point is because of Shas HaBir. The problem is that with regard to kruv, there is no Shas HaBir. And here we have a machlokas tanaim. What's the status of kruv? On a doraisa level, it would seem, again, this is highly theoretical, but there is no shas habir and chiyuv to be mavayer kruv. It just doesn't lend itself to that. And if it doesn't have a shas habir, then it's not osir b'torah svichin. But b'drabanan, since 99.9% of the fruits and vegetables, etc., have a shas habir, so the rabbanan were worried that if we allow you to eat the cabbage at a certain deadline, whatever that date will be, we'll have to figure out, past that deadline, then you might confuse cabbage and try to draw conclusions about other vegetables. So there's one sheet in the Tanoim that even in the case of kruv, we have to make up some sort of an imaginary shas habir. Okay. Now, it could very well be that in this machlokas about the status of svichei kruv, there are different minhagim. And in certain locations, they accepted the hora of one particular chacham l'kula. In a different location, they accepted the hora of a different chacham l'kula, l'chumra, l'kula, back and forth. And the issue is going to be what happens if you're in one location and then you go over to the other location, and our Mishnah will kick in. Makom shenagu, makom sheyatsa misham, matzah shahalach l'sham, etc. Now, in the story we're about to learn, what I find a little confusing is all the names. There are just a lot of names here. So we'll try to do the best that we can without a whiteboard behind us. Omar Rabba Bar Chana. So Rabba Bar Chana is telling us a story. Okay, so he's the storyteller. He's not actually part of the story until the very end of the story. Okay, now the story is that Rabba Bar Chana is transmitting what he heard Yochanan ben Elazar. Okay, so now we can put Rabba Bar Chana, just to avoid confusion, put him in the back burners. He'll come back a little bit later. And we're going to talk about the following transmission of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay. And he says the following. Here's the story that Rabbi Yochanan is telling us. Ham achas nichnasti. Now, it seems to me that the name Rabbi Shimon was very popular. The name Rabbi Yossi was very popular. So in certain cases, they had to even mention the grandfather's name so you know which person we're talking about. So there are many people by the name of Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi. And if you look up clergymen in the yellow pages, you'll find a lot of Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossis. So now we have to add Ben Lekanya. Okay, so the Zayda apparently was not a Muslim, his name was Lekanya. And says Rabbi Yochanan, again, as reported by Rabbah, I entered into a garden, and you will see there are cabbages growing in the garden. And who led me into this garden? It was none other than Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi, and so forth. And now we turn to Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis. Natal. So again, Rabbi Elazar is telling us that, I'm sorry, not Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, is telling us that this great giant of a Tana, Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi, Natal Svichei Kru V'Achal. He went into this garden, and I followed suit, and he took from the from the leaves of a cabbage, and he ate it. Okay, so big deal. Who cares? I have to know about a chacham who ate the leaves of a cabbage. The answer is it was after Shas HaBiur. And we're going to assume now, just for the sake of argument, that we're talking about a Shas HaBiur that applies to other vegetables in that location, in that area. So in that, Eretz Yisrael was divided, as you know, into three areas. There was Yehuda, Galil, Ephra Yarden. So in that district, it was already the Shas HaBiur for all vegetables. And no one was eating vegetables that they took out of their own private gardens until they would be mafkirit, which is the mitzvah of biur. And yet, Rabbi Yossi right? Reb Shimon Reb Yossi, I'll get the name straight, it'll take a while. Reb Shimon Reb Yossi took his own personal cabbage and ate it after Shas Habiur, which, by the way, is not totally shocking to us because, as we said earlier, there is a school of thought amongst the Tanoim that the halacha of biur does not apply to sfichei kruv. Again, we need two conditions. Number one, it has to be sfichin, so there was no violation of meleches shmita. And number two, it's got to be kruv, because kruv is the only vegetable of its sort that grows throughout the entire season. Whatever that means. Let's say the winter season, whatever that means, okay? But now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar has a leg to stand on that he witnessed personally Reb Shimon Reb Yossi eat from kruv of shvius that was sfichim liachar Shas Habiur. And not only that, it's very interesting. You know, this Reb Shimon was so excited about eating kruv and posketing that we can rely lakula, that there's not even an Issa D'Rabbanan with regard to sfichei kruv, that he feeds it to his Talmud, Reb Yochanan. And this is what Reb Yochanan is reporting. The achal v'nosan li, and he gave it to me to eat. Now let's just think. If everyone in that location, in that district, let's say it's Yehuda, I don't know, whatever, is noeg l'chumra, like that sheet in the Tanoim, that midrabanan at least, sfichei kruv are asur at that time of the year, then this Rabbi Yochanan has a problem. Why? Because he did not institute a horah. He didn't have a horah on this issue, but rather he was relying on Reb Shimon. Now we're going to have to discuss whether Reb Shimon himself had a hachra and a horah with regard to sfichei shvius, or he himself was relying on an earlier generation. In any event, Omar li b'ni, he turns to me, Reb Shimon says to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, B'fanai echol, you're permitted to eat kruv in my presence, but shelo b'fanai lo tocha. Now, Rabbosai, up until this point, if you recall the sugya we studied yesterday, there was never a distinction made between b'fanai and shelo b'fanai. It was either asur straight across the board, or it was mutter straight across the board. If it was asur, it was asur even b'fanai. If it was mutter, it was even shelo b'fanai. And now we're encountering a distinction between b'fanai and shelo b'fanai. And now Reb Shimon, the way it's reported by Reb Yochanan, is explaining to Reb Yochanan the difference between b'fanai and shelo b'fanai. Zok Reb Shimon, this is what he's telling his Talmud, Anira isi es Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai sha'achal, which means that Reb Shimon is, again, Reb Shimon Reb Yossi, is admitting, he's conceding that he doesn't have a horah. He had no achra on this issue of the status of sfichei kruv. The one who had the horah was another Reb Shimon bar Yochai. But he says, Anira isi, I saw Reb Shimon bar Yochai who ate sfichei kruv. And Kedayu Reb Shimon bar Yochai, because Reb Shimon bar Yochai had a horah. In other words, he had a svara, or he had a limudi alfusa, and and based on what he learned and what he understood, Tzviche Kruva Muta is Kedayu Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Lismoch Olav B'fun of Shalobafun. Now watch what happens here. If you're in the first generation of the Talmidim of the Mora Horah who actually gave a Horah, then you accept that Horah, and that's fine. You have a direct link to the Horah itself, meaning to the Mora Horah, and now you're allowed to eat it all over the place, anywhere. I'm just going to take a moment's break for a second to go back to the story that we had before about Chelev the Isera. And Rabbi Bar Chana said that he was allowed to eat the Chelev the Isera in Bavel when he came from Eretz Yisrael. And why is that? Because, just give me a second. Because he saw Rabbi Yochanan who ate Chelev the Isera on the bottom of the previous Amud. Again, not Rabbi Yochanan ben, not Rabbi Yochanan Atana, but Rabbi Yochanan and Amora. But that Amora was Samuch. Obviously, Rabbi Yochanan is a Samuch. I mean, I don't have to talk to you about the greatness of Rabbi Yochanan. Some in the Yerushalmi he's called a Tana. Anyway, so Rabbi Yochanan was a Samuch, and he was Machriya based on his limud to be matir Chelev the Isera. And therefore, Rabbi Bar Chana, who saw Rabbi Yochanan eat the Chelev the Isera, he accepted a Horah from his Rebbe, which is matir him anywhere. Again, I'm not going into the issue of Iyata Yochol Latiram B'fanav. That's a different issue. And therefore, Rabbi was very careful to conceal the Chelev when the other Rav Avira came in. You remember the whole story. But barring that issue, Rabbi Bar Chana, because he had a direct link to a Rebbe who was Mora Horah, he could allow himself permission to eat Chelev the Isra anywhere on the face of the earth. And so far, we could parallel that to our case of this Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, who saw, I'm sorry, scratch that, bad mistake. We could apply the parallel to this Rabbi Yossi, Reb Shimon Rabbi Yossi, that Reb Shimon Rabbi Yossi saw Reb Shimon Bar Yochai eat Sfiche Kruv, and Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was the Mora Horah who was Machriya LaHorah regarding Sfiche Kruv. That allows Reb Shimon Rabbi Yossi to eat Kruv, Sfiche Kruv, anywhere on the face of the earth. Okay, but now we go down one madrega. Why? Because now we get to this Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, who is not in the same situation as Reb Shimon Rabbi Yossi, because he's already 2 steps removed from the Mora Horah, from Rabbi Yochanan ben Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Now, when Rabbi Bar Chana, in the case of Chelev the Isera, instructed his son to avoid eating Chelev the Isera, he told him, let's go back on Toman Aleph, Bein B'fanai, Bein Shelo B'fanai. Do you remember that? B'ni, I'm going to just quote the Gemara, it's just a few lines before the end of Nun Aleph Amid Aleph, Lo Tochal, don't eat Chelev of Yeser, of Isera, Lo B'fanai, V'shelo B'fanai. Why? Because although I'm allowed to eat Chelev the Isera, because I saw Rabbi Yochanan do so, and he was the Baal Horah, you did not see Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore you have no permission. But here, take a look at what happens in this particular scenario, he turns to Rabbi, what's his name, Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, and he says to him, Ata, you didn't see Reb Shimon Bar Yochai like I did, says Reb Shimon Bar Yossi, and therefore you don't have a direct link to the Mora Hora to rely on. And now you're in a location where nobody's eating kruv, svichei kruv, because they have a hora from their chachamim. Again, I'm in a different position, says Reb Shimon Bar Yossi, because I saw Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So I have that in my back pocket. And I got it directly from my Rebbe as a hora from my Rebbe. And therefore I'm allowed to eat svichei kruv anywhere on the face of the earth. B'fanav v'shelo b'fanav. But you are in the next generation and you never saw Reb Shimon Bar Yochai eat a svichei kruv. All you're doing is you're relying on my testimony, which you absolutely believe, that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was Mora Hora to be matir svichei kruv. But now you're stuck because there are other Mora Hora, the bulk of which here in this area, in this district, paskin, based on their Hora, that svichei kruv is awesome. But yet, Reb Shimon Bar Yossi says to Reb Yochanan ben Elazar that b'fanai you're allowed to eat svichei kruv. Now, again, this whole story about the dialogue between Reb Shimon Bar Yossi and Reb Yochanan Bar Elazar is being transmitted by Reb Elazar. I mean, the story about their dialogue, right, is being transmitted by Reb Elazar. However, the Gemara assumes, right, Reb Yochanan ben Elazar, the Gemara assumes that since Rabbi Bar Bachana was the one who presented this story, he must have accepted this story. But now it comes out that in what I call the third generation, that's 2 steps removed from the original Hora, at least b'fanai, meaning in front of the middle generation, it's mutter. Whereas Rabbi Bar Bachana told his son that he's absolutely forbidden from eating chelev of the Isera anywhere, even b'fanai. I'll just read to you this note over here. He writes, Atzinu stira b'divrei Rabbi Bar Bachana, shebameshaber b'shem Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, in this last story about svichei kruv. And he's telling over the whole story of Rabbi Yochanan is afilu imra minag heter mimisha eno roy lahoros bedavar below hiter mitoch limudo usvaraso. Even though he did not, meaning again, Rabbi Yochanan Bar Elazar did not see a Mora Hora, in this case it would have been Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who is paskening based on limudo visvaraso. Nevertheless, Yachol lismoch olav, he could be matir and eat svichei kruv b'fanav, meaning in the presence of Reb Shimon Bar Yossi. Mishashara adam gadol shenag came. In other words, now we're saying that no matter how far removed you are from the original Mora Hora, nevertheless, as long as you saw an Adam Gadol, let's call him a Mora Hora, we'll use that term. Although, again, he was a Mora Hora in this instance, but he's an Adam Gadol, then at least b'fanav, it's mutter. So therefore, Harei Reb Shimon Bar Yossi, Hiter Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, Lechol b'fanav, Svichei kruv. In his presence, Reb Shimon said, take a cabbage, it's a good cabbage. We checked it for bugs, it's really good. Afilu, meaning afal pi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yossi I'm adding a word bi'atzmo. Lo hiter said dover mitoch limudo utsvaraso. He's just the agent of transmission. He's the middle guy who's transmitting from the Moral Ra to his Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan Bar Elazar, and yet he was matir b'fana. V'ilu Rabbi Bar Bachana, in the case of Chelev di Hayeser, Omar Libno, Shalo Yisloch al Minhago, V'afilu b'fana. Evan Shalo Hiter Machmas Svara, meaning because Rabbi Bar Bachana did not have an original Horah. And likewise, in our case of Sfichei Kruv, Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi did not have an original Horah. So why was he allowed to feed Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar? Ve'ilu Rabbi Bar Bachana Amar Libno Shalo Yismoch al Minhago. Again, getting back to Chelev, Afilu B'fana, because Rabbi Bar Bachana did not have an original Horah. All that Rabbi Bar Bachana had going for him was that he saw Rabbi Yochanan, which is okay for Rabbi Bar Bachana, but not for his son, who didn't see Rabbi Yochanan the Morah Horah, and therefore it was awesome for him even b'fanav. How do we reconcile these two stories? And what I think is really the thrust of this Gemara is how could Reb Shimon Reb Yossi feed Rabbi Yochanan Bar Reb Elazar the Sfichei Kruv? How could he feed it then? And we've seen that Rabbi Bar Bachana, in the case of his son, said you're not allowed to eat under any circumstances. Chelev Hayeser. So the Gemara says, my Reb Shimon. Now the Gemara wants to know, where is this Rabbi Shimon? We've been assuming that Rabbi Shimon had received the heter of Sfichei Kruv from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the Gemara now is asking, let's go back to the original source. Maybe that'll shed a light on why Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, fed Rabbi Yochanan Bar Elazar. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon Omer. This is my mistake. I think here we get confused with the names. I'm pretty sure that what we're learning now is not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yossi, because as we said before, he had no original Horah. He was just transmitting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So I think now you'll double check me and see if the sugya works out. That my Rabbi Shimon means, where did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai establish the heter of Sfichei Kruv? The Sanya Rabbi Shimon Omer, and Stam Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, I think, again, is Kol Asfichim Asurim. All vegetables that grew on their own and there was no Avodas Hasodeh, they're still Asur after the Zman Abir. Chutz Misfichei Kruv. So the leaves of this cabbage are mutter. Why? What was the logic that led Rabbi Shimon to accept, meaning with EX, I mean, not accept ACC. No, it's to accept Kruv, Sfichei Kruv, she'ein kayotze ben b'yerek hasod. Rashi explains that there's no Kruv out there in the field that is kol l'chaim and asod. There's only Kruv, which is Eino Kala L'chaya Min Asod. If there would have been another kind of a Kruv, that would be Kala, but there's no such thing. Kruv of any sort, of any shape, any color, any type, is not Kala Min Asod. In the Mela, it has no Zman Biur, and If it has no Zman of Biur, then there's no Isur and no Chi of Biur. The Chachamim Omrim, Kol HaSvichen Asurim, even Svichei Kruv. And the question is why? Says the Gemara, both Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim are arguing in the context of Rabbi Akiva. There are two interpretations of the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is going to tell us that Svichen in general, meaning forget about Kruv for a moment, but all Svichim that grow on their own during Shvius are included in the Chiyuv of Beer, and you're not allowed to eat them after the Shas HaBir. You have to be mafkir them. That's as far as all Yerakos are concerned. But Travayu Aliba to Rabbi Akiva, they both, meaning Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, are divided as far as Rabbi Akiva is concerned. The Sanya, right, the Torah says, I'll just read the pasuk, we are now, Rabbosai, about to learn the source for the Iser Sfichim Da'oraisa, according to Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva's Shita. So the institution, the enterprise of Sfichei Shvius is not the Rabbanon. It's not that the Rabbanon were afraid that if we allow you to eat Sfichim, you'll come to do Malacha and you'll fake us out and you'll say, no, it grew on its own, it wasn't mine. Forget about all that. We're now going back to the Torah itself, and in what I call an amazing diuk in the pasuk. I would read this pasuk 1,000 times and not see it. Rabbi Akiva came to the conclusion that the Torah is indicating that Sfichin are asur midoraisa after Shas HaBir. What does the pasuk say? The people are going to complain, so to speak, about the institution of Shvius. V'chi somru, it's a quote from the pasuk at the end of Vayikra. Manochal b'shana Shvius, hein lo nizra v'lo nesof es tvuasenu. Now, Rabbi Akiva says there's something superfluous in this pasuk. Rabbi Akiva, why didn't it suffice to say, hey, lo nizra? You've told me, Moshe Rabbeinu, that I'm not allowed to plant during the Shemitah cycle. So obviously, if I don't plant, I'm not going to be able to harvest my produce because I couldn't even plant. So why did they have to add below nesof es tvuasenu? Is it possible that there's a sifa of tvua without, meaning circumventing zriya, without zriya? In other words, in addition to the Isa zriya, there's another Isa called sfichin, which applies even without zriya, of vegetables, etc., that grew on their own. Okay, now we know that there's an Iser Sfichin Da'oraisa. Does that Iser Sfichin Da'oraisa, according to Rabbi Akiva, apply to Kruv? And on this we have machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. What would Rabbi Akiva's position be with regard to Sfichei Kruv? The Maiko Miflagi, Rabbanan Savri, Gazrinon Sfichei Kruv, Otu Shar Sfichin the Alma. You see, this statement is only feasible after the drush of Rabbi Akiva. If not for the drush of Rabbi Akiva, the whole enterprise of Sfichin is the Rabbanan. And therefore, to say that we're going to Gazrina and Kruv, Otu Shar Sfichin the Alma makes no sense. That would be Xera. But now that we've established the drasha of Rabbi Akiva and Sfichin is Doraisa, and the exception to the rule is going to be Kruv, So Chachamim say we have to be very nervous over here. Because if we're going to allow, which the Torah does, the eating of Svichei Kruv, he may come to eat other Svichim, and all other Svichim are also Midoraisa. For Rabbi Shimon Sober, Lo Gazrinon, Svichei Kruv, Atu, Svichei Dialma. We can notify the people and instruct them that they are enjoined from eating all Svichim, but they're allowed to eat Svichei Kruv. And we're not going to be worried that if we allow them to eat Svichei Kruv, they're going to jump to the conclusion that we could apply that heta to other Irakos, which are Kol L'Chayiv in Asada and Al Chayiv in Biur. They're not going to make that distinction. But according to the Chachamim, they understood based on Rabbi Akiva that even though there's no Shas HaBir in the case of Kruv, nevertheless, we're going to have to institute a Gzeira D'Rabbanan to Aser Svichei Kruv, because otherwise the people are going to say that, you know what, there's no Easter Svichin in Shvius. They don't understand distinctions between one vegetable and another. Once they heard that there's no Easter Svichin in one vegetable, they're going to assume and jump the gun that there's no Easter Svichin in any vegetable. And Rabbi Shimon has the opposite opinion. Now, as far as I can tell, the Gemara itself does not reconcile the two stories of Rabba bar Bachon. In one story with regard to Chelev, he told his son that since he didn't get the original Horah from the Machriya, from the Bal Horah, then he has to abstain from eating Chelev even B'fanov. And in the other case, when we dealt with Svichim, we saw that Reb Shimon allowed Rab Yochanan ben Elazar to eat the Svichei Kruv B'fanov. However, if you remember yesterday, we quoted a long presentation of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And in that presentation, Rav Moshe quotes a Meiri. I'm not that familiar with the writings of Rav Moshe. So to me, it was a chiddush that Rav Moshe would quote the Meiri. Like in our shirim in Rav Soloveitchik, like the Meiri was almost contraband, you know. Like, I don't know if he ever said this, but it would be Tzugapas. The Rav would say, who cares about the Meiri? You know, because the Meiri was not part of the official, you know, canon. You know, they discovered it too late. So the brisk, they didn't hear of the Meiri. But Rav Moshe, in any event, quotes the Meiri. And personally, I'll tell you the truth, I can't even begin to imagine leaving the Meiri out of our transmission of Torah. I mean, there's so many chidushim in the Meiri. And even if he's only summarizing what came before him in the generations of the Rishonim, even for that, it's worth it to study the Meiri. Anyway, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, based on the Meiri, there's no stira in Rabba bar Bachon. And why is that so? He says the following: Efshar, Shemasher Reb Shimon bar Reb Yossi, Itir l'Rab Yochanan ben Elazar lechol b'fanav Svichei Kruv, Hainu rak b'ofen sheReb Shimon ben Reb Yossi meiniach l'fanav sheyocha. Now watch what goes on over here. Rav Moshe is very sensitive to one little detail, which is not so small, according to Rav Moshe, in this story. And that is that Reb Shimon put the kruv in front of Rabbi Elazar, in front of Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar. Hainu, ba'ofen kazeh, im Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar ochel, hareze nechshav bichlal mashahora Reb Shimon ben Yochai lahatu dover zeh. So again, just get an idea of the forest, of the, you know, what should I call it, the trees at the end of the forest. Again, I don't know how we're going to get to those trees yet, but let's just see where we're trying to go. We're trying to link up this Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar together back to the previous generation of Reb Shimon bar Yochai. And that linkage is going to be accomplished by the fact that Reb Shimon ben Reb Yossi puts the food in front of Reb Yochanan ben Elazar. Again, don't ask me how. That's what we're going to try to figure out. But do you see where we're going? He says, Mishum, Shemasha Ochel, Mishum She'ein Misarvim L'Gadol. So now we're throwing in a new variable into the equation called Ein Misarvim L'Gadol. So that when Reb Shimon ben Yossi puts the food, in this case the cabbage, in front of Reb Yochanan ben Elazar, he says to him, take a bite. So the principle now is Ein Misarvim L'Gadol. Again, that doesn't explain really why Reb Shimon did what he did and fed this Reb Elazar, Reb Yochanan ben Elazar. He says, Ein ze nechshav sha'ochel me'atzmo. It's not as if Reb Yochanan ben Elazar is eating the kruv on his own initiative. Ella Reb Shimon ben Reb Yossi machilo. And if he's being machil him, then he, again, this Reb Yochanan ben Elazar is now attached, so to speak. He's like hanging on to the coattails of Reb Shimon ben Reb Yossi. It's all included in the achila of Reb Shimon ben Reb Yossi. They're sitting down and having a meal together, and there's svichei kruv on the table. And whatever heter applies to the Adam Gadol, automatically, ipso facto, applies to his Talmud. Aval im haya Rab Yochanan ben Elazar ochel shelo b'fanav. Rav Moshe is trying to make sense out of the difference between b'fanav and shelo b'fanav. As ein ze nechshav li ochel behoraso shel Rab Yosef Reb Shimon elo li ochel me'atzma. He's not eating with Reb Shimon Reb Yossi, he's eating on his own. Ubazeh ein kvar koach shel Reb Shimon, meaning Reb Shimon bar Yochai, the original. So in other words, the koach of Reb Shimon bar Yochai's hachra is passed on to the first generation, which would be here in this context Reb Shimon bar Yossi, but not to the second generation, unless Reb Shimon bar Yossi is feeding Reb Yochanan ben Elazar. If he's feeding him, then they're eating together. It's one achila. Very abstract concept. And that links them back to Reb Shimon bar Yochai, the original Mora Hora. But if on the other it's Shelo b'fanav, then when Reb Yochanan ben Elazar is eating on his own, then that he's cut off from the Hora 2 generations earlier of Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Ubazef shalavayr sherabba bar b'chana libno shafilu b'fanav lo yochal chelev hayeser b'ayim became it shekola heter lechol b'fanav zemishum she'ein misarvin l'gadol. And he says that this principle of ein misarvin l'gadol does not apply between a father and a son. Uben came into ragil lishosim aviv ein chisaron derech eretz im yisarev li aviv. Umemela gam kshaochel b'fnei aviv ein ze nechshav sha'aviv ma'achilo ela sha'ochel me'atzmo v'lachein ein lo lechel afilu b'fnei aviv. Now again, Rabbi, I'm not saying that I'm dancing in the streets and I'm really excited about understanding the presentation. What I'm excited about is that Rav Moshe, based on the Meiri, came up with some distinction between the two cases. And the distinction is between a Rebbe who's feeding his Talmud and a father who's feeding his son. And when the father's feeding his son, he says it's not a chison derech eretz if the son refuses to eat. And in this case, the reason he's refusing to eat is because he didn't have that linkage to the original Orah of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, as opposed to the case where this Rabbi Yochanan Bar Elazar is a Talmud sitting at the table of his Rebbe, Rab Shimon Bar Yossi, and Rab Shimon Bar Yossi is putting out the kruv, and he's inviting his Talmud to partake in eating the kruv. That expands the achila in such a way that not only is Rab Shimon Bar Yossi connected to the original Horah of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, but even Rab Yochanan Bar Elazar is connected directly, so to speak. But that's only b'fanav and not shalom b'fanav. So that's what we have here on this sugi. Now, at this point, we go back to the Mishnah, and in our text of the Gemara only quotes the first two words of the Mishnah, and that's right here in the middle of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis. I would quote the entire Mishnah, and the Mishnah says that Haholich mimakom she'osim malacha bi'arvei psochmar chatzos. So he comes from his locale where they're mekil and they allow malach in the morning of the 14th, and he arrives l'makom she'ein osim. He shows up at a place where they abstain from malacha on Erev Pesach in the morning. Or in the reverse case, he comes from makom she'ein osim. So his local minhag is lahachmir and to abstain from malacha, and he comes to a makom she'osim. And the Mishnah establishes no simal of chumrei makom she'yotzim sham, chumrei makom she'holech l'sham. He gets the raw end of the deal on both ends of the rope, and he always has to pick up the chumrah, whether it's the chumrah, the local place where he finds himself, or his original local chumrah. And then the Mishnah says the following: Shelo yeshana adam mipnei hamachlokas. So the Gemara says, what do you mean Shelo yeshana mipnei hamachlokas? Bishleim, I understand how that principle should apply. In aholech l'makom she'osim. I'm sorry, mimakom she'osim l'makom she'ein osim. So he wants to continue his minhag to do malach on Erev Pesach, and that's going to create a heck of a machlokas here because they have a tradition and a minhag not to do malach on Erev Pesach. So that I understand. Is no sinol of chumrei makom sholach l'sham shelo yishanim al yishanim b'nei hamachlok v'lo li'avid. So you shouldn't do malach. Elo. Now let's take the opposite case. He comes from a local minhag where they desist from malach, and now he shows up in a place where they do malach. And now you're telling me he has to carry with him his old minhag, meaning from his original birthplace, Eretz Moladito. And what is it with Bnei Machlokas? What are you telling me? That if he would do malacha here in the new location, the way the locals do it, so that would be a machlokas? He says, "Mimakom she'ein osim l'makom she'osim." What does it mean? Al yeshana adam b'nei machlokas. Adarab, on the contrary, if we want to allow him to do malacha, then there won't be any machlokas. And you're telling me no, if b'nei machlokas, he's not allowed to do malacha. What do you mean? You could have told me, al titosh mitorasi mecha, that you're obligated, you're committed to your original minhag until you relocate on a permanent basis, and that would be fine. So nosim olav chumrei makom sheyatsa misham. But don't tell me that the reason why he has to desist from malacha is because of shelo yishanim b'nei machlokas. That doesn't make any bit of sense. Ha'amrit nosin olav chumrei makom shehalach l'sham b'chumrei makom sheyatsa misham, meaning that you're going to impose upon him the Isur Malacha because of Chumrei Makom Sheyatsa Misham. What does that have to do with Machlokas? Amar Abaye Aresha. So Abaye says we have no choice. We have to assume that even though these words in the Mishnah, Yishanim Bnei Machlokes, appear at the end of the Mishnah, but nevertheless they go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. And Al Yishanim Bnei Machlokes refers specifically to the case where he was knowing in his local place to do malacha, makula, but he shouldn't be makil in the new location because they abstained from malacha and that would create machlokas. But the other halacha, namely that if he left a location where there was an Isser malacha, he continues with that minhag of his original location, that applies even without machlokas. That's irrelevant to machlokas. Rav Amar li olam ha-seifa. Rava wants to say that lo yishana mipnei machlokas applies in the seifa, and we're talking about a case of holech mimakom she'ein osim lemakom she'osim, and he has to continue his original minhag and abstain from malacha. But now we have to be very creative in terms of the language of the Mishnah. V'hachi kama, and here's what the Mishnah has in mind: that he has to continue his original minhag and desist from malacha, even though the locals here where he arrives are doing malacha. So everyone's doing malacha except for him. Ein bazum mipnei shinui machlokes. That even though he's abstaining from malacha, that's not called machlokes. Meaning, the reason why we have a right to impose upon him a strict observance of his original minhag, mimakom sheyatsa misham, is because this would not cause a machlokas. And why is that so? Demai ka'amrit, what are you going to tell me? That hara omer malach asura. Hey, this guy is not doing malach on Erev Pesach. It must be that malach is asura, and that contradicts our minhag, because we have a minhag that you do malacha. That's not what's going to happen, but rather, Meimar Amri, Kama Batlani, Abi B'Shuka. Okay, he's a Batlan. He doesn't want to go to work today. And that's why he's abstaining from malacha. So the fact that B'Shei V'Alta said you are not involved in malacha, that doesn't contradict a heter to do malacha that's locally accepted, because people are going to say the reason why he's not doing malacha is because he's a Batlan. He's not the only Batlan out there in the shuk. Okay, Rabbosai, this is where we're going to take a break. Okay, then. And I just wanted to read to you a kasha from the Tzlach. He writes, Madua hevia gemara b'sofa kusha smacha shaninu notzenol of chumrei mokom shaholach l'sham. Hare ikar kusha himimasha shaninu shenosen olav chumrei mokom sheyatza micham. That's the piece in the Mishnah that we didn't understand. So why does the Gemara go back and quote the entire Mishnah, including the Reisha of chumrei mokom sheholach l'sham? That doesn't seem to be relevant to the Gemara's question. And he answers it, Tzlach. He says, Lule masha mivia Gemara gamas masha shaninu notzin olav chumrei mokom sheholach l'sham. When we impose upon him to continue the chumrah of his original locale, that's only until he gets to another place. He's on the road. But once he settles down in a new place, he has now arrived at his new location. He's not bound by the minig l'chumra of his original location. V'noi k'minig makom shebalasham v'lo mishanim ipnei machlokes. He should not insist on his chumra in the new location because that would create machlokes. Avol mimasha shaninu nostin olav chumrei makom sheholach l'sham v'chumrei makom sheyatzim misham mashma sheshtei chumros mutolim olav ki echad. They're both equal. Sheim yesh chumra shenogu b'makom sheyatzav misham v'chumra shenogu b'makom sheholach l'sham noeg eshtein. we can even imagine a scenario in which he'll have to take upon himself two chumras. One chumrah from the Makom Shiyatzim Misham and another chumrah on a different issue, the Makom Shalach L'Sham. Val Karchach, Shechumros Makom Shiyatzim Misham, Nagos Gam Achar Shebo LeMakom Hasheni. From this equation, we come to the conclusion that when we say that we impose upon him the chumrah of Makom Shiyatzim Misham, that applies even if he has already arrived at his new location. Below Rak Kodim She'igia. And we're not going to limit it to while he's on the way, he's traveling from one place to the other. Im Nagos Rak Ad Makom Ad Bo LeMakom Hasheni Kein Lo Timtza Shetis Kayamna Chumros Makom Shiyatzim Chumros Makom Shebo L'Sham Kiecha. If the Mishnah is trying to tell me that he might be chayiv in both chumras, it must be because he came to a location, and in this new location, he has to pick up not only the chumras makom shiyatzim misham, but also the chumras makom she halach l'sham. That is the tzlach. So b'li neder, tomorrow we start here on the bottom of daf Nun Aleph Amid Beis Amalei Rav Safra. Rabbi Wishing you a great day.